Mute. Share. Okay, Lauren, you're whenever you're. Oh, I do have that popped up here. See if I can pull that down. Just tied this down the corner. Okay, for all you online, we're just about ready to get started here. So Lauren, I'll turn it over to you then.
Okay, I assume the mic is pretty much here on the laptop for the online folks. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us here in lovely Yorkville. I'm Lauren Wobig. I serve as the director of the Office of Water Resources in the Illinois DNR and as chair of the Illinois State Water Plan Task Force. And so welcome to our third and final outreach session that we've had ongoing since we chose to begin this State Water Plan update process pre-COVID, so many months ago now. And so this represents the northern area part of the state, or this time of the day here in the afternoon. For those that can join us in person, thank you for coming to Yorkville, and thank you to those online who are able to join us virtually. We do have several members of the task force here in the room. Wes Couture and Tara McParlin head up teams, and BJ Murray heads up a team as well as part of the task force. And Megan McKinney has been serving as our executive secretary and keeping us in line as a task force as well. And so we do have other members of the task force that have joined us virtually as well today. And so we're getting towards the end of this update process. And so we're at that point where we wanted to do this third outreach to all the stakeholders and interested parties in the State Water Plan update. And so we're covering today this time and this location in Northern Illinois. Tomorrow we're down in Southern Illinois in the Carterville, that's kind of between Marion and Carbondale area tomorrow evening. And then on Monday, we'll conclude with a third of this third outreach session in Springfield at the Department of Ag. And that is maybe at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. So that's kind of the outreach. So without further ado, we'll get into going through the presentation here, and then we will have time for some question and answers about the plan here going forward. Wes, what button am I pushing? I did, and it wasn't.
Space bar.
Maybe the space bar.
Oh, there it goes.
What did you push there?
I think it was just highlight on the Citrix.
Oh. All right, thank you. Yep, that'll work now. It's going. Just have to be smarter than the PowerPoint, right? So this afternoon, what we want to, obviously we're not going to go page by page through the updated plan. I think there were at 144, 145 recommendations. We're not going to go through every single recommendation. We'd be here until dinner time. So what we want to accomplish today, though, is we're going to quickly, my part of the program here will cover a quick recap of the history of the plan, and then we want to cover these questions about what is the water plan, what's different in this plan, and then how do we intend to use the plan. And then Wes will get into some of the plan development and overview of the highlights, and Tara will then step in at that point and also help us go through an overview and the highlights portion of the plan and how we intend to use it and what's in this final draft version of the plan. And then I'll step back in to wrap things up for this afternoon. So just real quickly, of course, the State Water Plan dates clear back to 1967. Illinois was one of the first states in the nation to have such a plan. And then the task force that helps create this plan was actually appointed by Governor Thompson back in 1980. Excuse me. I should have told everybody to turn off their cell phones, and then I didn't. And so back in the 1980s is when they had the first task force meeting, which then created an updated state water plan in 1984, which was updated then in 1994 as well. And so we have not had an update since that time. And so that is what brings us here today, is now an update of those issues and some new issues that were brought about as part of the water plan. And so, as I mentioned, the State Water Plan Task Force is that group that's charged with developing and then implementing the State Water Plan. And the State Water Plan Task Force is made up of all these agencies shown on the screen. Essentially, it's all of those state agencies that deal with water in some way, shape, or form. So obviously, IDOT is involved from all the navigation and all of the, the bridges and everything that we deal with water there, and Department of Agriculture and DNR and State Water Survey. So it's that whole compilation of water-related agencies, IEPA from a water quality standpoint, that come together to address the water issues in the state, and then to work on implementing recommendations that are brought forward as we look at those critical issues. Excuse me. And so then what is the State Water Plan? Well, it obviously has a mission to define and look at those water issues facing the state and how we come to address those issues in a unified manner, and then to prepare, a plan that really provides guidance on programs and policy and legislation that we need related to water moving forward. And then we are able to provide that to the elected officials, to the governor and General Assembly, and those decision makers, local and clear up to the governor within the state on those issues. But what it really is opportunity. And it's an opportunity to step in and get something done and use the plan as a vehicle to accomplish the changes that we see are necessary in the state of Illinois. Sometimes I've referred to it as our Trojan horse, right? So rather than Lauren Wobig saying, well, hey, I have this great idea, I think the state ought to change everything to do X, we're able to bring it up through the task force and use a system that's in place that involve all the agencies to really look at an improvement, a change to a policy, a program, in order to advance where we believe the state resources ought to go when we're dealing with a particular water issue. As I mentioned, there's been a couple of other published plans that have been in place. So how is this go around different from those previous efforts? First and foremost, there was a deliberate attempt to include a social and environmental justice perspective. That was not there. That was not in the limelight as much, if you will, in the past years, in the 90s and the 80s when this was developed. Didn't enjoy the same attention that we give to those issues today. And so this plan deliberately tries to take that perspective into account as we look at whether we're looking at water quality or impacts from navigation or from flood control, all of that aspect, to bring that in. Updatable is another way. And so, in the past there was a written report, and today it's handed to the governor and the elected officials and said, here's our nice report. We intend this to be more than that. We are preparing a written report, and that's what we have in draft form today. But it's not just that. It's really, we have the website and we have these issues, and we want to keep it more dynamic and ongoing. What's happening on issue number 13? What's happening on issue 27 or 112? What's happening, and it keeps dynamic, and people can stay plugged into things that are happening, and we can give updates on those issues as they're developed. And so that process is now set up through the task force as we get into the plan in this manner. Same thing with being accessible to the public, right? With a website and able to go in and look at exhibits and maps and updates and what's happening on a given issue. And we of course have GIS that's more to our advantage now than it ever was in the early 90s, or especially back in the 80s. And then the plan is from the task force that we can, rather than go, from 1994 to 2022 before we've done an update, be able to do some annual status update reports that can be provided to the public. So we're set up in a much better way to try and keep engagement active and progress reported. And then we will do an official update. This is saying, every 10 years, approximately that long, because as we saw in this process, COVID delays aside, it is a couple of year process to kind of reassess all issues, define what's important, and move forward on those issues in a published report. We did do a survey about how we thought, asking how would you use this water plan once we get it updated. And what we found is actually there's a lot of varied uses. This was kind of enlightening. Typically we get into the public policy reforms, right? How are we going to change state programs? How are we going to, change state policies? But what we found is, for example, there's a 13% that say, well, I want to, continue to use this plan as we do infrastructure planning. We want to incorporate it into our local comprehensive plans of what we're trying to do locally. And, regional watershed planning, public education was another 20%, the largest intended use of the plan. Of course, state agency programming, that was kind of what was in some of the mission statement. And then finally, being able to, with recommendations, put forward saying, hey, we need additional funding or new resources to advance this issue or bring some resolution to this issue of concern related to water in the state of Illinois. So that's basically showing us that we do have a lot of uses of the plan other than to just try to change state policy or a state program. So that's kind of a quick overview and where we're headed. And now as we kind of get more into how the plan was developed and some of the meat of the plan and how we comment on the plan, I'm going to turn it over to Wes Couture, who is our not only part of the State Water Plan Task Force, but the Chief of Engineering Studies in the Illinois DNR Water Resources. So Wes.
Thank you, Lauren. As we're kind of doing a hybrid meeting here, I'm just going to check on our online participants here. We do have a large group online. I just want to make sure we're not running into any technical difficulties there. So if you'll just bear with me here to make sure that we have nothing in chat. So, okay, just looking good with our online. So thank you. Appreciate that. So as Lauren kind of gave an overview of the history, I want to talk more about how this plan, this current update is being processed. So if you've been to our other public outreach meetings, you've seen this chart before. And this is kind of just an overview of what the plan development process was. We talked first about going in and organizing. That's where we pulled all the task force members together, got everybody actually together, which was something that we were struggling with 3 or 4 years ago with the State Water Plan Task Force, was having full participation, getting everybody's buy-in that this is something that we should be doing as the state of Illinois. Figuring out what issues are critical, what do we need to look at, who's going to take charge of that. So not throwing that all on the chairman to do, but actually divvy up those topics and see who's willing to take lead on these various topics that we've identified. Establishing those consistency practices so that we're all, for each section, those are consistent. Then we went into research and outreach. So that's where we had outreach 1 and outreach 2, where we focused on identifying the critical issues. What do we want to look at, and what recommendations do we want to have to address those critical issues that we're seeing? And then that also included a lot of public outreach, and that kind of is concluding with this third public outreach. And then we're kind of transitioning into this published stage where we're combining all the reports and sharing that final report with you. And we'll also be talking about next steps and status updates as we go into that published phase. I gotta click back off of the WebEx. There we go. Okay. So just a little bit more of a blow up on the public outreach, or a little bit more detail. We talked about how we identified those critical topics and issues. We did our outreach in December and May, so that covered outreach 1 and outreach 2. Outreach 1 in December talked about what are the big ticket items, what are the main subjects we want to focus on, and May kind of looked at, well, what are the recommendations? How are we going to address those issues? Then we're moving into finalizing those recommendations, preparing the draft report, and here we are today at the bottom of this chart with our final public outreach session. Okay. All right, so just an overview. So now that we've gotten this report to share, what is in the actual report? So what can you expect once you open this up? Well, as you can see, we have this broken up into 19 sections. The first section being just an overview letter from our task force chairman, Mr. Lauren Wolbig. Section 2 is just showing the agency support. This was not done by Tara McFarland doing her section and her section alone. It was brought to the whole task force and making sure that all agencies within that task force are in full support of each recommendation we've had. We've actually had times when we've had one topic lead want to propose a recommendation and we said, no, we can't support that as an agency. So that has been kind of vetted through that process. And it's also been vetted through the public outreach as well. But that's where we can say that we have full agency support for these recommendations. Section 3 is just a lot of introduction. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Section 4, we have social environmental justice, as Lauren alluded to. Section 5 through 17, that's where we talk about the specific critical topics that we've identified as the main body. So this is where we say, this is what water issues we have, say water quality. What's wrong with water quality? Well, maybe we have problems with microplastics or something like that. Okay, so that is in those 13 topics. It also includes the recommendation for how are we going to solve this microplastics issue, things like that. So just know that's in the main body of the report is that sections 5 through 13. 18 kind of summarizes all those recommendations and cross-cutting topics, and Tara will show a little bit more about what that includes. Section 19, conclusions, and the appendices at the end. So, as mentioned, we are focusing on this report on social justice goals. I'm not going to read everything on this slide to you all, as you can see, but we do want to prioritize that equal access to the health, well-being, and opportunities and resources of the state. And that's fairness among all these different criteria that we're looking at. So that is addressed, and hopefully you'll see those in some of the recommendations we have, that the social justice is always, in those recommendations, social justice is kind of woven into that. And we also want to talk about the environmental justice as well. You can see that through in the recommendation sections that's involved, whether that's making sure that we don't overemphasize one community or helping them in the decision, strengthening the public's involvement, things like that. So again, just another focus on social environmental justice. That is its own section within the report. Then, as I mentioned, we move into the 13 topics. Again, this is where we do the deep dive. So you can see we have 13 critical topics that we identified in our first public outreach. So that's what you see here on the slide. Each of these issues has their own chapter, and that includes, as I mentioned before, kind of a background paragraph, the identified issues, the recommendations, are all in there. So again, this is just an overview. Again, I won't read the 13 topics. You can see them all there. But again, I just want to reiterate that those are the issues that are going to be in the final report. Then also kind of in that front half or in that report, we also have some general tools available to help the general public understand. As with state government, federal government, we have our elaborate amount of acronyms, so we can make sure that we spell those out on what those acronyms are. Definitions to some of these more difficult terms that may be more technical in nature, so that making sure everybody kind of understands them, and then kind of more some key terms that you will hear that may not be as quite technical, but that you'll see reoccurring, just kind of expounding on those not necessarily defining, but kind of expanding on what that fully entails. You talk about water quality, that can mean a wide variety of things. So that kind of just clarifies that. So this is an example section of one of the reports. So you'll see each of the 13 topics will look similar. They're minus the coloring and pictures and everything, of course. But you'll see they start with an overview section, as you see on the left page here. They'll go into the issues on typically a second page. I think most sections are typically 2 to 4 pages, if I recall correctly. So we try and keep them concise for a purpose. We don't want a 600-page document. We're trying to keep it very concise, and can be at the topics lead if they want to publish more detail. That can come in a supplemental report at a later time. So the purpose was to keep this very concise and not have 50 pages on water sustainability and another 50 and 12 other topics as well. And then we have the recommendations. So this is the summary table. This will probably be where most people will want to go to when they look at the state water plan. So this will be developed for each section, where we list on the left side here. This is kind of that identified issues, which we talked on the previous slide. It's kind of written here in paragraph form, but we kind of have what the issue was in the next to that. The second column is what the recommendation is to address that issue. How are we going to address it? How are we going to move forward and resolve that issue? As you see, the third column, we have the lead agency. That's just saying who is taking a lead on this. So maybe you know who to reach out to if you want an update on this. So that's essentially the entity for us to also track. How is this being done? Who's in charge of it? Also lets the public know that much as well. The second to last column, funding, you can see that we have a variety of funding descriptors, whether that's can maintain the annual funding that program currently has, or that activity currently has, and maybe an increase in funding. It could be just a one-time funding. Say if it's a research activity that needs to be conducted, maybe we need a white paper on something to do with climate change. Increased, an example would be we need to see how evaporation has changed with climate and what's that's going to look like in the future. That could just be a one-time research topic that's done over the course of a couple of years and it's done. Whereas some of our programs may be an annual reoccurring initiative. And then finally, we have in the last column the action. So that's essentially stating what is it exactly? What type of recommendation? This allows us to kind of categorize our recommendations, whether that's a program that we take with internal staff and that we monitor and move forward with. It may be an individual study, which is, again, kind of using our research on evaporation example. It could be a policy saying that we're going to implement this one thing, and maybe that's legislation, maybe that's just regulations within a set of policies. So just so you know, that's going to be kind of the bulk of where you're going to find the recommendations, and kind of what we saw was the key information within the report will be this recommendations table. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tara McFarland. She's kind of been our chief editor on the report. So she's done a lot of work on lifting this up. She's also the head of our flood surveillance program. She's the topic lead for the flood mitigation section. So I will turn it over to you, Tara.
Arrow.
Huh?
Which arrow?
Down.
Down. Okay.
Yep.
Well, thank you. I am going to go back a slide. Les did a great job. I just wanted to mention that, again, like he said, that the report itself is trying to be concise, short, cut to the chase. We know people have limited times, attention spans nowadays. So just recognize when you read the report that these committees have been working and meeting for several years, and they have a little bit more background about what all these issues and recommendations are. So when you read these recommendations, we couldn't put everything in the table. We didn't want each recommendation to be a page long. So when you read these, this is the gist of it. There is more information and more work will be done. And I just wanted to mention that those committees that are part of each critical topic, each topic has a committee that meets regularly, and the task force meets regularly. So once this report that's going to be released today, it will be posted on the website. And it's the draft report. We want input from all the stakeholders, the partners, and everybody that's been involved. But just recognize, like Lauren said, this is continuing. The committees are going to continue to meet. We're going to be developing those status reports. We're going to be measuring how much of these recommendations have been completed. So again, I just wanted to point out that these recommendations are sort of short, but know that there's been a lot of thought and a lot more detail than can be described in the report. So that said, I'm again, we're not presenting all the recommendations, but I'm just I tried to summarize the arching ideas that we came up with in the report. So one of the first things we noticed is out of all those 13 critical topics, we've come up with 144 separate recommendations. And so that table that we just looked at, each topic has anywhere from some have 4 all the way up to some have 25. And it just depends on that committee and how large those recommendations and how much work each one would take. So just recognize that there's a lot of meat to this report, and each one of these recommendations, the hope is that with the support and the funding and the legislative support and the communities and your stakeholders, we're hoping to get all these accomplished. So it's a big ask, and we need help. So of those, I was able to, as I mentioned, we all had separate committees meeting for these different topics. And I found it very interesting that what we're going to find, and I'll be talking a lot about, are cross-cutting issues and recommendations, meaning one committee may have come up with a recommendation, and then we found out that the other topic had a very similar recommendation because they're connected. So if we fix one thing in one category, we're actually assisting and helping another topic. So, and it turns out that out of all these independent groups that were meeting, 6% of the 144 were exactly the same. Not all the same, but for instance, flood might recommend doing some shoreline erosion protection, but then that also was a recommendation needed in the habitat and restoration. So I just found it interesting. These are the fun parts of the report. So that 6% of the recommendations, that all these minds were thinking alike. So I thought that was great. Of all the recommendations, 29% were cross-cutting, like I explained, and I'll show you in a little bit that one recommendation tied into another person's recommendation. Out of all the recommendations, there were specific social and environmental justice indicated in the recommendation for 23% of the recommendations. And that said, that's when I was able to actually find a reference to a disadvantaged or underserved community and helping them specifically. But recognize that a lot of the recommendations are also assisting and focusing on that social and environmental justice. Lauren will be talking a little bit later about one of the key recommendations in the report about providing an information center to provide information to the communities and to the public. And part of what we were finding, that out of all the recommendations, 25% of those recommendations that we've come in have some form of outreach request, because what we're learning is we have a lot of information in the agencies, but the communities and the people that we serve get a little confused. So 25% of these recommendations have some form of outreach to help get all this information out where it needs to be. 30% of the recommendations require some additional data collection, analysis, or some sort of studying or sharing of that information. And that's what we've found, that, we're state agencies. We all have our programs and our missions, but what we need to do is a lot more collaboration and sharing of that data. There's no sense in two different groups going out and soliciting and obtaining the same data and coming up with their own paths. So the idea is to bring this all these water groups together, all these agencies, and share that data. And when you share that data, you're also having an economy of scale. So some of that money that's saved, you could actually spend on getting the results. But I bring this forward because it's important to understand that sometimes those recommendations, like Wes said, it's a one-time funding request to get more information. Sometimes what we found is we know there's an issue, but we really don't know how to fix it, or we don't exactly know the extent of the problem. So it's really hard to fix a problem unless you have the information to help you solve the problem. So some of these recommendations do require some studies and data collection. So just keep that in mind when you look at the recommendations. You might think, well, that's not going to solve the problem, but recognize it's a step to get the information we need to fix the problem. 14% of the recommendations actually have some sort of these collaboration and working groups and pulling communities and watershed groups together and try to help solve the problems. So that was just another interesting facet. And then I'll talk a little bit more later, but out of the 144 recommendations, 112 require funding, and 23 of those require some form of legislation change. All right, here's some just examples, and these are outlined in the report. These are just a few of those duplicate exact recommendations. And the first one I'll mention, these two different groups, both Lake Michigan and Navigation, decided that we needed to maintain and upgrade ports. That's the recommendation. And then when I went to look, they were in both of the categories. So again, if you fund one, you're helping the other topic complete their task as well. So that was an important thing to see, so that even though we have 144 recommendations, we do have some overlap. And then we just thought it was interesting to look at the different themes for some of those recommendations and see which of those 13 topics covered those particular overarching themes. And this graphic, I just want to let the group know that are reading the report, we're trying to make it like a color code for you, so that every time we talk about water quality, the section has everything in blue. The tables are in that light blue. And then when you go into the climate change section, everything's red. And when we're comparing the topics, we're always using those colors. So it should help us to make the report clearer and a little bit easier to understand. But that said, just for an example here, we went through all the different recommendations, and I tried to find areas that were similar. And in this first one, the first one is nutrient loss reduction strategies. And there were several different recommendations in many different topics. And so I just went through and tried to mark which of those we saw that theme in water quality, aquatic and riparian habitat, and erosion and sedimentation. They all felt that was a theme related to their recommendation. So again, I'm not going through it all. It's in the report, this table, but I was just trying to explain how all these recommendations sort of tie together. And then we have some graphics, and we put these in the back of the report because there ended up being so many of cross-cutting recommendations. And what I mean by this is we looked at every single recommendation and we tried to see what other topics were impacted by that recommendation. And so these visuals just help you see, again, each topic is a color that are on the outside of that graphic, and then the center button type figure is the recommendation. These are in the appendix, but it's good. Hopefully, ideas our audience is a general assembly, and we want them to realize that the things that they approve and support and help fund have broad and far-reaching impacts. So this was just our way of illustrating that. So when Wes talked about each table and each section has those 3 columns on the right, One of those was what type of funding's needed. So we went through and we just added up all the different types. We only allowed each group to have certain types of funding so that we could all be using the same terms to help everyone understand what type of funding. And at the end of the day, out of all those 144 recommendations, the highest amount that needs new annual funding. So that means these are new issues, new recommendations that aren't currently being addressed by existing programs or existing legislation or anything out within the agency programs. And then we also, as Wes mentioned, that there are some that just require one-time funding. And so 27 of the 144, you fund that study or that data gathering effort once, you're done, we get the information we need, and we get to utilize that for the next step. But there are quite a few, and I think everyone assumes that everything we are requesting requires funding, money, money, money. That's all we want. But quite a few of these don't require any funding. It's just requiring collaboration and sharing information and things like that. So this just breaks down all the recommendations. You'll note if you are really a detailed person, they might not add up to 144 because sometimes some recommendations had two parts. One might be that it needs new funding to do a program, but it also needs to maintain the existing. So the numbers won't add up. It's not a mistake. And then we looked at those different actions. Again, we want the General Assembly and those to understand the impacts of this water supply or this water plan. And so at a glance, the legislators can see that the most of our recommendations are related to programs, whether it's maintaining our existing programs or providing new staff to allow an existing program to be expanded or to develop a new program to address one of those issues. And then 26 or 28, we need new studies. We need new information to help us move forward. At 23 of those recommendations require very specific legislation changes, new laws, or even just modifications to existing legislation to enhance existing legislation that might not be serving the needs or the intended, what we intended the law to address. So again, this is just an overview of that. And then we went ahead and Wes had mentioned we've assigned a lead agency to each one of those recommendations. But that doesn't mean that other agencies aren't going to be involved with the solution. It just means that that agency is responsible for making sure the work gets done. But they get to collaborate and they have other agencies on their committees. And but when it comes down to it, like Wes said, if you want to find out the status of a specific recommendation and what's happening and what you can do to help, which I hope you do, this sort of breaks down which agencies are responsible. And you can tell DNR, we're the leads, we're taking a lot of them. Right now, we have the most of the recommendations assigned to us, but we also have different offices within DNR. And so I did break this down into the different IDNR offices, but if you add up all the IDNR, we have 71 total of the 144 recommendations. And when I say we, it means DNR as a whole with all these different offices and different groups. But other groups and agencies have been assigned these recommendations as well. So this just helps the legislators see maybe what agencies are going to be requesting additional support over the next few years if we get to move forward with this state water plan recommendations. So we're at the stage now. Again, I'm not presenting everything in the report. Those were just some of the highlights. But we are opening up this public outreach forum to get input. We're soliciting input from the public, from our stakeholders, our partners, our communities, anybody. And Lauren will tell you a little bit more in a few minutes of how to get that information out there. But we have a website, and we are going to have a form on there that gives feedback for the report. And we have some specific questions. We want to make sure it's clear. We want to see if you understand things. Are there ideas that you might have to enhance some of the figures or graphics? We've asked a lot of questions, and it will be a Google form document that there'll be a link on the website probably by the end of this week that you go to after you've read the report or you've reviewed the report. The report will be posted today. As soon as we're done with this meeting, I'm posting it. It's a PDF document. It's ready to go. And we want you to read it. We want your feedback. And so you'll fill out those online forms, and it will also have an area even just for mistakes that you see, a spelling error. You just tell us the page number, tell us what to fix. So you can fill that form out online, or if that just doesn't work for you or you don't have internet access, for your community, you could always print that, get somebody to print you out the form. You can fill it out by hand. You can scan it and you can just email it to us. You can also just email your general comments to us to this email address. And you have until the end of this September. So our goal, and Lauren will be talking about the remaining schedule, but we are giving you a month to really read it carefully, and help us make this a report that fulfills everything that you need to have. I mean, ultimately, you are who we're writing the report for. And we want the report to include the aspects that are important to you and make sure they're conveyed in a way that help you. So this is your chance to help us help you. So, and then there's the web address is at the bottom, and you can reach out to any of us to get that website. So, where do we go from here? I'm going to turn it back over to Lauren, and you might all ask, where is the state water plan going after today?
All right, yeah, thank you, Tara. And the key point to build on of what Tara said is that it's an ongoing process. The task force is there to carry out these recommendations and these issues. As Wes talked about at the beginning, we have 13 key focus areas, right? That started as like 130 different issues. We tried to combine some of those and really put them together to have this particular update put a spotlight on those 13 issues. But there could be an issue that's out there that really isn't highlighted necessarily in this report. Doesn't mean it's not important. Doesn't mean that the task force might not still give that consideration and talk about that moving forward. So I just want to hit on that point as well, that we had to pick some particular focus on the issues. Doesn't necessarily diminish other issues that may be out there that would come before the task force as well. And so where are we headed again with the state water plan and the future? One of the key things, and this is actually one of the 144 recommendations, right, is that the task force is more deliberately funded. This has really been kind of a grassroots effort from within the agencies. It was Lauren Wobig as chair with support from Wes and Tara and others that said, hey, it was 1994 was the last time that we really did kind of an update. And so it was really me as new chair coming into that, reaching out to the agencies and saying, hey, it might be time to update this, this report, this plan. Everybody immediately was on board with that, but it was all without any sort of budgeted resource or capability to say, yeah, we can fund employee X so many hours of the year to do part of that. We want to try and formalize that a little bit more, provide the agencies the resources they need to help us stay unified as a task force. And then, of course, those committees that Tara hit on that focus on whether we're talking about flood control or navigation or water quality. There are those subcommittees that include many stakeholders and interested parties that would continue to meet to carry out the recommendations of the plan and to address new issues there. Obviously, the funding recommendations that Tara hit on and where we need to ask for money. Continuing to update the website. That's this idea of the plan being dynamic, right? That it's not a one-time, put it in paper and put it on the shelf for another 10, 15 years. It's this idea that the plan continues to update, and we continue to try to keep people informed and engaged through all the media capabilities and internet capabilities we have at our disposal. And Tara's been very diligent about trying to make sure that as we look at recommendations and actions from the State Water Plan Task Force, that they're measurable actions, right? How do we tell our stakeholders and constituents and people interested in that issue that we're making progress? What have we done? How do we measure that it's more than just lip service to some of these actions? We've already talked about, needs of updating legislation, having report updates, and of course, every 10 years or so, putting it in paper or having kind of a reassessment of all the issues. In the middle here, we talk about the Illinois Water Information Center. Actually, it's the Illinois Integrated Water Information Center, because all these topics and issues are so integrated in nature, as Tara has pointed out, with some of the cross-cutting and similar views of a same issue. And so we are working with State Water Survey right now, and actually there's draft legislation being put together to create this integrated water information center through the University of Illinois and the Prairie Research Institute. But in essence, and it seems fitting as we're, those of us in person today are in a public library here in Yorkville, this information center really is that library of all the water information that we have. Right, so from all of the various aspects of water, from, again, water quality to flood control to navigation to recreation, you name it, where do we keep all this information? There is a plethora of groundwater information alone, not to mention all of the various models, hydrologic and hydraulic models that are prepared on all the many streams and rivers we have in the state of Illinois. Well, where do I find the model on Silver Creek in Ford County? Does a private consultant have it? Does DNR have it? Does the State Water Survey have it? Does IDOT have it? Well, this idea of this integrated water information center puts all that information in one place, not only for the state agencies to use to implement programs, but for citizens and other users and stakeholders to have access to that information as well. So even as we prepare to finalize this report, there are recommendations like that well underway. And to build off that, basically, we need your help. And so number one is we have this draft report together, look through it, provide feedback to the draft report, even as detailed as Tara mentioned, spelling errors. If they're, by some, rare instance, there would be a spelling error in the report. Share this with others, right? This is certainly a state plan for the state of Illinois, and the citizens and the businesses and the stakeholders within Illinois that engage in water in some way, shape, or form on a regular basis. And then as you go through and as we have these various recommendations, and Tara mentioned a number of them will require funding and support from the General Assembly, reach out. If there's a particular issue that's a specific concern to you and you're able to get behind that recommendation, help that group reach out, spread the word, and get support for the implementation of that action. So remaining report schedule here as we work to wrap up. We're here in August, and we're holding these public meetings statewide in order to present what's in our draft plan update and to solicit review and comments and input one last time before we try to finalize that effort. And so we're looking for those comments by the end of September 30th, to gather those. And Tara went through how to do that. We would accept even written letters sent to, the DNR for that matter. We're very open to how we receive those comments during that time, whatever is convenient for you. The State Water Plan Task Force then meets a couple of more times to kind of consolidate and go over all the input that we've received and to give that final push go button, and we hope to then have the published report here in the November timeframe of this year, certainly yet this calendar year. And so again, stay informed. There's the website. We can certainly provide that to you in emails and other ways if you give us your contact information. But keep up to date, stay plugged in there. It is the state's water plan, how we use it. It's your water plan. You can simply search, Illinois State Water Plan, IDNR Water Plan, any of those will probably bring up the first hit being this website. I've done that several times. It's sometimes the fastest way just to quickly get to that page. But keep up to date, stay plugged in. We're certainly aimed on having measurable results. And of course, I get to do the thank yous. Thank you to Yorkville Public Library, first and foremost, for this facility today and offering us the opportunity to use this facility for our outreach. Certainly the general public and everyone who engaged. There's a number of entities that their purpose in life is to focus on issues related to water from the various perspectives, and that's really made this plan rich, right? Having those perspectives to plug in from all of these entities that have their own bent, right? From agriculture to particular environmental concerns and open space and you name it. They come to it with their set of goals and objectives, and that's what's helped make this plan rich and useful. So certainly our stakeholders and partners and the committees and those that have dedicated, again, as a volunteer effort in essence, their time and energy to these subcommittees and to these issues behind the report. And with that, I'm on an advance. There we go. Again, I'm Lauren Wobig, director. There's my contact, Wes Couture, who spoke, has certainly been engaged in the development of the state water plan from the onset. And then Tara McParlin, who also spoke and has really been serving to pull all of this together into a report format that we can share. And our contact information is there. So big thanks to some of these leaders who have stepped in to make that possible. And so with that, we'll go back for a question and answer time. Wes, I don't know if you want to go online and see if we have any in the chat first that we can handle, and then we can certainly take questions from those in the room as well.
All right, so if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to type them in the chat. If anybody has any questions here in the library, feel free to raise your hand. We'll just call you out.
Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Lauren, can you kind of summarize that so our folks online can kind of hear that again before
Sure,
you
yeah,
answer?
the question is really within the state water plan, that would be within the water quality section of the plan. Are we addressing the fact that we're still getting, constituents showing up in some of the water quality assessments coming up in there, and does the plan address that? Did I summarize that correctly? And yeah, within the water plan itself, obviously, water quality was one of those key 13 topic focused areas And that committee, and I'm sorry, I don't know this, I haven't memorized the specific recommendations within that section, but the recommendations and the programs are aimed at that type of an issue, right? How do we better deal with that issue? Now, I would say as you look into it, if you want to go to that particular section of the report and see if that's addressed the right way, and if it's not, certainly welcome not only a comment to say, well, hey, in that case, I believe the IEPA is the lead agency with water quality for the state, how do you see addressing that? Or that there is that subcommittee then that is there working that particular chapter, if you will, of the plan and how we move forward. And that would be, a group that's focused on that specific issue that you can plug into and say, well, hey, how are we moving forward? What are we doing to address that? That helps. That may not be a direct answer to say, yeah, recommendation number 132 says X, but I guess I point that out that the programs are there, and certainly to that issue was big in the water quality perspective. PFAS, is a big part of that, and the plastics, so forth, that we find in our waters and some of those concerns. So that is the intent of the water plan, is to try and put spotlights on those new issues. That's truly why we need to update the plan once in a while, because there are constituents that show up now that may not have been a concern back in 1994, or weren't being even tested for back at that time. So that's why once in a while you have to come back and say, okay, where should our focus as a state be when it relates to water quality, and what are we looking at, and how are we looking at that? That help? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, comments?
I just wanted to add, speak up whenever you have a question, but this meeting was recorded. We're going to record all 3 meetings that we hold. Those will have links and posted on the website. On that website that Wes just had up there, we have all the lead people for each topic. So as Lauren mentioned, if you do have specific questions, reach out to that lead. Their emails are on the webpage, and their contact information. And I do know that particular topic that you brought up has been addressed. It might not have a solution in hand, because some of these new and emerging topics are very challenging, and that they're new and emerging and we don't know a lot about them. But I think it's important that you know that it is recognized, and we know that it's an issue, and we have to figure out how to either minimize or come up with some solutions. So I hope that helps, but there is more information on the website at any time.
I will note that participating online today is Chris Davis. She's certainly an active member of the State Water Plan Task Force, and she is one of the key members from the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency that deals with that exact issue, and her subcommittee that deals with the water quality aspects of the highlighted. So your question was heard by EPA. I want to make sure you know that today.
There any? Yes.
Do you have any industrial people, industrial companies, and so forth involved in this?
Yes, so what we did, I can speak specifically for the water sustainability section. Our committee was almost somewhat tiered. Within the water supply program that's currently occurring now, we have committees that report to a committee administrator. Those committee administrators were part of our water sustainability committee. So there's an opportunity to kind of funnel this information up and down to power plants, to industries, to local businesses that have already been kind of somewhat engaged in that, because they already kind of understand what's going on in the water sustainability. So they were kind of incorporated into that committee through that administrator of that regional water supply committee group. So I can speak specifically for my committee. There have been, I'd have to defer to each leader. That's one thing that we'll include in the final report. We're still kind of compiling that last details of each committee member that participated in each of these 13 topics. I believe the intent is to include that information in the final report. So,
You know, as we stand here in Yorkville this afternoon, obviously this region of the state has a lot of focus right now on water supply, right? What are we gonna have for water sustainability? You know, we're depleting our groundwater resources, and what does that mean? And should we be getting Lake Michigan water or adding, taking more water out of the Fox? Those are all kind of what's driving some of these water sustainability, water supply, Lake Michigan kind of issues noted in the plan.
so Lauren, Christy Davis, her PA asked to be unmuted. So Christy, if you can hear us, I'm going ahead and unmute you. Feel free if you had something more you wanted to share.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, if you can speak up a little bit more, that'd be great. If not, I think we may be able to get your message through.
Oh, okay, I'll try closer. Yes, I'm Christine Davis. I'm with the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. What I wanted to say was that the recommendations that are included in this update to the state water plan, when the agency was doing reviews of the recommendations, that the agency would be the lead or somewhat responsible for the implementation on it. We were looking at the time frame of the plan itself, and we're using like a 7-year, 5 to 7 year, could this be accomplished or not? So a number of the recommendations that initially started off with, we need to do water quality monitoring for X or Y, were actually changed to, we need to investigate how the state can do a study of it. It's not to avoid doing it, it's just that we are a very slow-moving body, and we first have to find the funding, we then have to find the staff, and then we have to come up with the guidance on how the project will be implemented. So we didn't want to put something in there to say we were going to accomplish something in 7 years that quite possibly could take 13 years or longer.
Yes. So Christy, did you hear that? It was talking about the outreach component. Would that be even further out?
And unfortunately, I didn't hear the question, so I was just typing that I'm hearing silence.
Yeah, I'm gonna have you mute. I think whenever I'm not muted or we both have it, Megan echo. So to understand correctly, would the public outreach pertaining to water quality and drinking water, would that come even further beyond? So we're talking about 13 years or so before the public outreach component could come through on that?
I don't think so. What the example that I was using was for more of a water quality monitoring. There were a lot of recommendations that groundwater should be monitored, that surface water should be monitored, that drinking water should be monitored. And again, we have a lot of those programs in place, and they can, they'll be working. But for some of the newer ones, we were saying, let's go back and figure out what's really going to benefit the citizens of the state of Illinois and develop a program that's effective and efficient. So I don't want you to use the example that I just used previously regarding when we're going to be doing outreach as an agency, but I can't speak to that for the individual programs. So if they can put that in writing to us, we can go ahead and answer it. We can get it to the right person here at Illinois EPA to get you the appropriate answer versus me talking in general about some of my coworkers' programs.
Now, follow up to Chris's comment, I mentioned that Integrated Water Information Center through the University of Illinois. Obviously, as we went through these and the various topic leads, education was one of those most frequent cross-cutting kind of things, right? We've got how do we in program X educate about public? How do we in program Y educate about the public? And so we've also envisioned this library concept, this integrated water information center, to help be some of that outreach as well. How do we, where is a centralized location? How can we help do outreach and inform the public from a centralized focused perspective? So that plays into some of that development as well. And how do we do that? You know, when, again, I mentioned like the social environmental justice perspective. How do you do that to folks that, you know, may not have internet at the ready, you know, or may not have the smartphone to immediately, you know, say, hey Siri, how do I blah, 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 right? So we've taken some specific measures on how we focus on being able to educate and communicate those that maybe hear the word, particularly about water quality, as you bring up. How do we get that information to those folks and let them know what's happening from a state perspective? Other questions or comments?
One thing I will just mention as people are generating questions is that the first and second outreach really kind of focused on what were the issues and what were the recommendations. Not that we can't address those, but we've already received a number of recommendations, suggestions, things like that. For those that have made those recommendations, say, oh, wait, we don't see them in your new table. It may be that has been taken to that committee and for one reason or another decided not to include that. Maybe it's something that all the agencies of the task force couldn't support. It may be that it's just not doable within this, 7 to 8 year window that we have to working. Maybe it's that it's a priority, but it's not in a high enough priority to take care of it with this iteration. It may be rolled over to a next iteration of stays to work with. Again, we have a certain amount of resources we have to work with and staff. So know that these are things that we're really going to push to accomplish in the next 8 years. And by throwing everything in this report, that would then limit us to what we could accomplish. So just want to keep that in mind. This outreach is really focused on, is this shared in an understandable manner? Do you have any recommendations on things that we didn't include outside of maybe those recommendations and issues items? We Tara did a great job kind of trying to convey some of those cross-cutting issues and summarizing the data. If you want to see other summary tables, things like that, please share that with us that we can include. Is there anything else that you feel that we left out of the whole report and not maybe specifically on the recommendation side, as we've already had 2 public outreaches kind of focused on those? Feel free to please share that as well.
Question?
Do you have any tie-in with the legislature? Problems that you.
Absolutely.
So Lauren, can you just restate that for us to make sure?
Basically asking, the plan includes a number of recommendations that would include legislation, some legislation required to advance an action, to address an issue. And certainly each agency has its own kind of direct link, but as a task force reaching out and really at this point in the process, as Wes kind of shared the process, we are beginning that outreach of, hey, this is coming to your desk. Get ready, know that they know what particular issues their constituents are focused on, and they're part of the state. Could be all 13, could be 2 or 3 specific ones. And so we're kind of prepping them to know that this is coming. So when it does arrive, they're prepared to know how to best use it and what they need to go forward. And that really, as we talk about next steps, is to identify those champions. And we need the legislative champions as well to say, well, if we need this legislation created, we need a sponsor, in one house or the other there. And so that will be a big part of what is included on moving forward on these issues to do that. Fortunately, we do have scientists and some engineers in our Illinois General Assembly, and there's several of those that are ready to step up. And likewise, we have some that they've made, environmental justice a key component of their platform. And so they're ready to dive into those recommendations that include that kind of event to it and say, yeah, I'm ready to start working with the stakeholders and working to advance that. So the short answer is yes. But obviously there's a lot of moving pieces to getting legislation, but we're working to be prepped that way.
So, and to kind of expand, Lauren, you have had meetings with the governor's staff in collaboration with this effort. They know what we're doing, they know what is coming, and they're fully supportive of this
And
initiative.
that's truly, truly, we started the previous administration, right? And because COVID delayed us, that's why it maybe took a little longer than normal, but we started under the previous administration. And so when Governor Pritzker came up on board and his team, and new legislators for that matter, came into office, we had to make them aware of what, hey, guess what? This is what your state agencies are up to with this task force. And they're like, okay, yeah, tell me more about that. And the more we explained, and they were particularly delighted that we had selected, decided that this one needed to focus on social and environmental justice and equity and so forth in the realm of water. And so once they learned what we were up to, this administration quickly jumped on board and said, yes, we're behind that, let's go.
Okay, I guess we'll
Any
give
other-
another minute or two to
Right.
chat. Make sure you get your questions in if you'd
Yes,
like.
ma'am. One more question. Right,
So Lauren, you want to restate
yeah,
that?
sure. Yeah, the question for those online was, does the Integrated Water Information Center already exist? Or, kind of what's behind the continued push on that, or is it something brand new? It exists in part, pieces of that. And actually in the 1994 plan, the same concept was introduced, right? We need to have a centralized library, and it did not come to fruition because it really hadn't landed in a good home, or found somewhere where somebody was willing to take on that, those responsibilities. And so this time around, it came up, and truly the Illinois State Water Survey and DNR kind of had the same revelation of need, that we really need to have this today as well. Why isn't it there in form? And so to where there was enough push to really try to put some more meat to the bones to say, well, this is what that would be. And so there is no, in fact, like I mentioned, a model, right? An engineer wants to design a new bridge on Sugar Creek in Mason County. Well, where do I need to have a modeling to start to do that design? Who has that model? And they have to do lots of phone calls. Hey, State Water Survey, do you have that model? DNR, you guys have that last model? DOT, who has that? And so the idea was that, no, we need that centralized library. And really, Kevin O'Brien, who is the chief of the Prairie Institute Research Center there at the University of Illinois, said, you know what, that makes a lot of sense. This is a good home for that. That is something we as a public institution, university, should be and need to be doing for, water and for the citizens of Illinois. So we now have really a willing leader, if you will, that says, yes, let's take and work that. As I mentioned, University of Illinois, in collaboration with several other entities on the State Water Plan Task Force, has drafted some legislation already, and we're vetting that right now as agencies to find the sponsor to let it forward to make that happen. And of course, that comes with the need for funding to do that, the staff and resources that will take. So we have to make sure that legislation comes with the justification and support to ask for that money to create that. Why is that a good expenditure of tax dollars for that purpose? And, who is that serving within the state of Illinois? Kevin O'Brien. What is his title? He's the
Director of State Water Service.
director. Yeah.
Illinois State Water Service.
Illinois State Water Service.
I would just add, the IWIC or this library of information. We also envisioned it when we talked earlier about GIS, and GIS is a way to visualize and have maps. And what we sort of see is eventually you can click on an area and you might not have that information exactly how it's in that library you're talking about, but we'll have links. We'll have links that take you to where that data is, or the contact of where you may be able to find that data. And then we also envision that, that this will be, we call it sort of a clearinghouse hub of information, that they have all these agencies, and all these agencies have this information out there, but it's really tricky sometimes to find the right piece, or we get down these rabbit holes. So we're hoping that this is more of a clearinghouse and gets you where you need to be, as opposed to randomly searching. It's also a hub of information.
KDN, as I mentioned before, right? Water supply, water quality, certainly key issues. You're seeing, newspaper articles on a regular basis about that, particularly in this part of the state. And so then it's like, well, I keep, reading these articles on the newspaper or hearing them on the news. I want to explore that a little further. How do I learn more about that? This center would be that a good starting place. Hey, well, I want to know more about what is the groundwater. Why are we having to not stop using our wells and on and so on. So that was kind of the concentration there. It's really trying to make state government more efficient in a way, so that we're not so siloed or different programs. And Wes and his team have some stuff to do with water quality, and State Water Survey has stuff to do with water quality, and IDOT's gotten some stuff as well, and so it really tries to make that more efficient from a user, from a citizen's perspective. How do I find out, get information? So it's really, it has that kind of a focus beyond a consultant or somebody saying, hey, I need a model, or I need.
We have another question in chat. You can see it right there. I have it pulled up, the last question.
Well, there's that, it kind of depends on what the question is. Who are some of the legislative champions who are excited to work with and hoping will advance for water legislation in future sessions? And that really kind of depends on what part of the state at. The short answer is we have a number of champions who are aware of what's going on throughout the state, and so, we certainly have state reps on the Fox River, for example, and we have a whole section focused on recreation. And of course, recreation on the chain of lakes, that's a huge economic driver for some portions of, of the Fox River. And so as we're looking at recreational improvements or habitat improvements on the Fox chain, those legislators are saying, yeah, I'm ready to grab that. If we're downstate, or we're talking about some other public water rights, or I want to be able to canoe any stream that's out there, what do we do about that? There's some legislators that have been plugged in about those kinds of issues. So it's hard to say, well, I've got, 3 that are at the ready. It's Representative Foster, for example, he's an engineer by trade, right? And so he's got a strong interest, and he's been a strong advocate for all things water in the state, and how we advance the use and public use of our waters. So I can't give a clear, I have these 5. We probably have dozens that have expressed an interest in some particular portion because it matters to their district, and so they know where the hot buttons are and how that plays into where water is, and they stand at the ready to introduce legislation. And truly, this gives them a better opportunity, rather than to be like, well, I've got these constituents that keep coming to my office and complaining about X. Now they can simply say, hey, we have a state plan that recommends this action. And so I, as an elected official, am ready to step up and help advance this action that was agreed to by all of these state agencies related to water. So it has that immediate backing and support that they can advance easier than just trying to, lift up a particular issue because there were a few people that said, hey, I really want some change here. So it gives them, I guess, that extra oomph to push forward and champion an action because it's in a plan that's been approved by the state agencies related to that issue. Yes, sir.
Are you doing anything in relationship to the Great Lakes area as a whole, those surrounding states, to coordinate any information at that level?
Short answer is yes. One of the 13 topics is Lake Michigan in there, and that collaboration. I, as an individual, represent the state of Illinois for the Great Lakes. I'm on the Great Lakes Commission and the Governor's and Mayor's Compact Council. And so we certainly make them aware of the issues. And as we talk about, invasive species, for example, is a key component that's addressed in the plan. That's obviously shared. Here's what Illinois has plans, what we're doing, where we're going. Recreation, tourism, we're seeing a rapid growth in the cruise industry, for example, on the Great Lakes and some of these smaller cruise ships. And so we want to promote that tourism in the state of Illinois and what harbors might we be going into in Illinois and how does that tie into a grander scheme of recreation and tourism. And that all is touched on in the plan. So yes, there's a specific focus on those issues in the plan.
Yeah, you may have answered it, you may have stated it earlier in the presentation, but I have a hard time wrapping my head about who approves this. It sounds like there's agreement amongst the executives of the different agencies, but is there any kind of approval process? Does the governor receive this?
Yeah, good question. So the question for those online is who approves, right? And that's kind of where do we go with the plan? And the answer is yes. The letter that I will write as chair on behalf of the task force is to the governor and the General Assembly and saying, hey, elected officials, here is a plan brought to you, developed by your professional staff within the state of Illinois for consideration. And so there is no necessarily approval, but it's an understanding that here is the plan. And so that if we advance recommendation number 46, they would know already that, okay, well, we're advancing one of the recommendations in the plan that you've kind of given your blessing to. Yes, I want us to have a plan. So this is one of those in there. Does that mean that the governor might say, yeah, you know what, as that has developed, I'm not willing to get behind that. That's always a possibility with anything, right? But it's not really that we're asking for their approval. It's more of just information. Here it is. Here is the plan that you understood we were going to develop for you. That could be, there's probably a similar for like energy in the state of Illinois, which probably, there's a similar group that's working on, here's our plan for energy in Illinois, whether that's solar or wind or turbines in the Great Lakes, a number of things could be considered, are we burning fossil fuels? And so it's just like that. It's a plan that we advance in order to continue to try and take actions for that leadership. So we don't officially, it's really, and as Tara pointed out at the beginning, we have kind of that state support. And so we essentially get the Secretary of Transportation, the Director of DNR, the Director of IEPA saying, yes, based on my staff and recommendations, we as an agency support that. So when the governor and the General Assembly's agencies are putting forward something we support, then they know that it's something they can get behind. So we don't really ask for approval. The approvals will come with individual legislation, with appropriation requests, those kinds of things. We're just showing them, here's the roadmap of where we would like to go in the realm of water.
And I was gonna add, you just said roadmap, but we look at it as a blueprint. Here's your blueprint roadmap, and we've already prepared it. So like he said, earlier, that you don't have to have each agency coming up with their own plan and everything getting lost in the shuffle. But the other thing I wanted to mention was back in 84 and 94, when they did these state water plans, there were some members that were part of the task force that were in their agencies at that time. And that original plan had about 130 recommendations. And at one point, they did a status report. And the status report said that of those, say, 130, 120 have had certain amounts of action taken. And some of those former task members mentioned that whole new programs were developed in their agency based on the recommendations from the previous state water plan. And for the last 20 years, they've worked on that, in that program that was started because of the state water plan. So the idea is that we're just advancing with emerging and changing goals, and they change. So I mean, that's the idea, is to provide this cohesive plan to make it so we can start moving instead of just talking about it all the time. So that hopefully helps.
I have no further questions from the chat at this time.
No one here in the
No,
room.
no worries. Yep.
Well, number one, the question is about diversions, right? Diversions out of the Mississippi or the Great Lakes to the arid states in the West. And it's not a silly question, because it is a very topical issue right now. And so it is included in the water plan. I believe that's in the regulatory sections in there. The short answer is we are not going to provide that water. Okay, and there have been proposals brought forth, serious proposals from, conglomerations of industry and others that want to do that. Number one, from the Great Lakes perspective, Illinois is a part of the Great Lakes Compact, right? I mentioned the Governors and Premiers Compact Council that I sit on. That was a compact passed by all the Great Lakes states and 2 Canadian provinces, Ontario and Quebec, that basically said, we're jealously guarding our water. And that truly came about because there was this idea by this private company that was bringing in oil tankers into the region for energy. And so they thought, well, oil and water don't mix. So if we're coming from Saudi Arabia, we'll bring tankers of oil into, the Great Lakes region, dump our load, discharge our oil, and then let's fill it up with Great Lakes water and take it back to the Middle East. And they started doing that, and all of a sudden there was this, oh my gosh, what's happening here? And so that's really what prompted the Great Lakes Compact to where now we are in a state compact, multi-state compact that says no. In fact, other than Illinois, because we have the largest population in the Great Lakes, we get our water by Supreme Court decree. So truly, a lot of history behind all of that. We were taking water and we were sued by the other states. And got worked out in the Supreme Court. So we get about 8 million people in the Northeast Illinois area get the drinking water from Lake Michigan by Supreme Court decree. And that's all part of that compact. When it comes to Mississippi, again, we've had people that said, hey, I want Great Lakes water. We've said the answer is absolutely no. And so then they moved down and said, well, we would like Illinois River water. And we say, well, that's just Great Lakes water coming down towards the Gulf. And the answer is no. And so then they've gone to the Mississippi, the upper Mississippi, and again, the state of Illinois is part of the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association. And that is the 5 states that, encompass the Upper Mississippi above the confluence of the Ohio. And there's also a diversion policy in place. And so not only do we regulate what states are diverting or using water out of Mississippi, but that is truly there to say, no, you are not taking Mississippi water and taking it west. And not only from just the straight water perspective, but we get into the biological perspective. So if you talk to like a fisheries biologist or somebody, they would tell you that that is biological Armageddon, right? Because there are organisms and there's just a whole characteristic in the Mississippi watershed that does not exist today in the Colorado watershed. And so it's more than just moving water from point A to point B. You're moving ecosystems from point A to point B in the nation. And they've said that is, you'd almost have to boil all the water before you put it in the Colorado River to avoid all of that. And so there are certainly plenty of protocols set in place to allow us to say no to all those proposals that come along.
Have you heard the rumor that because of the water shortage in the west, that the big deal is going to be for people in industry close to the Great Lakes?
Yes.
Or some fresh water.
And that, yes, good point. And that truly has been the state's answer, right? Don't take our water, come use our water, right? Let's move Silicon Valley to the Great Lakes region, right? Bring that industry, bring those jobs, bring those resources to the Great Lakes or the Mississippi watershed for that matter. So that has been a consistent message from the states. Come here, we're not going there. All right, we're at a little after 2:30. Any other questions? Certainly, we're here, happy to answer any questions online. I don't think we.
I don't see anything new in the chat pop up yet, so it looks like we've got everything addressed. Feel free to throw anything in before we wrap up.
Give another minute, and we're still here, so if other questions pop into your mind, for those that are in the room, we're certainly here to help answer those as well. Thank you again for everybody that showed up today and participated online. Again, it's all helpful. I hope that what we shared was helpful in sharing where we're going and what we're doing with the state water plan. And so I think with that, thank you, and we'll call that a wrap up unless you have
Yeah.
anything else.
No, I'll just say that we're looking forward to receiving your feedback. So please feel free to share your feedback. As we've stressed many times, this is the state's water plan. So we want to make sure that if there's any concerns or any comments you have, we'd really appreciate receiving those.
All right, thank you. Everybody have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.